Well, we've been engaged in the international arena for some centuries now, not only since the establishment of the United Nations or even recalling the memory of Descahe and the experience with the League of Nations preceding. But our indigenous nations of this continent, Abya have been engaged in attempting to negotiate through diplomacy with the government states and their representatives in this continent for some centuries, beginning with their first arrival on our shores in the central part of what is now known as Mexico in the early 1400s. And it was always established since the beginning that the relationship between our nations, our confederacies of nations, and their systems of confederacy, whether it's the UN, the World Trade Organization, whatever their entities may become to be described, that the principle that would express the relationship was be one of reciprocity, that we were bound by honor and dignity to respect and honor they and them, and by the same principle, they are also bound to respect and honor our voices and our position as authorities, indigenous nation authorities of this continent, of the Western Hemisphere, and by extension now with the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples throughout the world. When we saw what occurred on the last day of the Permanent Forum, even though I was not present, but we did get to see a video footage and were given personal reports of individuals who were there. They called us directly. It's an issue of concern because of the lack of appreciation, affirmation, and understanding regarding our original agreements of understanding the reciprocity that must coexist, that must exist and be coexistent between our systems of jurisprudence in the international law and those of the United Nations system, which represents states, the government states of the UN system. There must be a principle of reciprocity, respect, and understanding. Our systems are not subservient to theirs. Our systems are very much more ancient than those particular sets of international legal norms that have come to be known as the United Nations system. Our system, in fact, precedes, by jurisdiction and authority, the mandates of the UN system just by fact of time and history and the indigenous reality of being the original peoples of the planet. So that's our jurisdiction. In terms of the procedures and protocols of interaction in that case, now with that clarified, the basic principle of respect, reciprocity must be reaffirmed, and part of that reaffirmation has to be put in place to clarify that yes, there is such a thing as the mandate of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and yes, it does originate and is referenced by the Economic and Social Council definitions that are again rooted in the very foundation of the United Nations system itself, whose membership is exclusive to states, government states. We can participate as NGOs in different fora, but the actual ownership of the membership right within the UN system belongs exclusively to the states. Now, we are nations. We may not fit the category or criteria of being states, but we are the nations. Our constitutions are those that are grounded in the natural laws of this Mother Earth and the universe. And again, this precedes the authority of jurisdictions implied or imposed by the government states of the UN system in this continent and throughout the world. So coming back to the UN, the mandate for the Permanent Forum exists. Its origination is very clear. It's very well documented. There's tons of documentation for that mandate. The clarification is that as indigenous nations participating under the principles of reciprocity and respect with that forum, we also have mandate. Our mandate supersedes that of the UN system by fact of history and time. And so there should be an appreciation and understanding that we operate under dual mandate, and the officialization of the interactions of the indigenous peoples in the Permanent Forum and that of the Secretariat, let's say, or the reporting systems that are generated officially by the UN must take that into account, and the positions, objections, clarifications of the indigenous representatives that are brought forward in New York at the Permanent Forum are just as official and must be officialized to the same degree in the reporting systems that are then returned to the world as we address the issues of commonality that we are there to address collectively as governments, government states, and nations of indigenous peoples. And this can be done procedurally through different mechanisms. There's proposals being discussed about how this should be done and must be done by the next session. But coming back to the incident of what happened on that last Friday of the last session, we participated along the process, now these 7-8 years of the Permanent Forum, in the formation of an independent autonomous caucus of the region of Abya. As we come to understand and see represented in the action that was taken on the floor that Friday, the last day, it was being brought forward by the caucus Abya. And by clarification, this is not just the caucus of Latin America. This is not just the caucus of North America. This is the caucus of an entire continent of indigenous peoples, Abya, that has come to be known as the Americas, North, South, and Central America. But under Abya, we present ourselves to the world community, to the UN system, as a representative voice of the indigenous nations of this continent, Abya, which has now come to be known as the Americas. And so we have also taken within our hands then the power to define our own region according to our own terms that precede colonization. And this is nothing more than an expression of those rights, self-determination, that are referenced in the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples now adopted. So this is part of the proceedings that have to be officialized and facilitated by our delegations and their secretariats. And I say that in the plural, because if there's 2 mandates, there should be by logic 2 secretariats as well, working on bringing that documentation forward. And both sides of those secretariats, both reporting systems, should be acknowledged as being official in terms of a forum of dialogue and discussion to deal with these world issues. This was the purpose of the establishment of the forum, and this is the mechanism procedurally that we have to reinforce and reestablish where it has been forgotten, because this is why we're there in New York.